counter this morning's talk, I'd like to introduce Richard Bifield. He's friends of Ironbridge Gorge, and I think it will be a very interesting talk. So I'll hand you over to Richard.
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. First question usually, can you hear me at the back? Is this working okay for you? Yes. Right, thank you very much. Ironbridge Gorge, thank you for inviting me back again, by the way. I think it's a couple of years since I was here last. Ironbridge Gorge World Heritage Site then and now. What I've done, as you can imagine, is to begged, borrowed or stolen old photographs of the gorge, 100, 120 years old, some of them, and gone back to where I think that original photographer had stood with my camera in the last 2 or 3 years to take the view you see from that viewpoint now, so you can see the difference between what it used to look like and what it looks like now. I'm starting at the west end of the gorge, around the Birthplace Bridge area, and I'm moving east down the gorge, and I'll end up at the Carpark Bridge end. And we'll see the changes that have happened, or in some cases the changes that haven't happened in parts of the gorge over the last 100 years. And right at the end, I thought I'd just bring you up to date with what the museum sites, or the 10 museum sites of Ironbridge Gorge Museum look like now. Some of you may not have been back to Ironbridge for some time, so I'll just bring you up to date as to the changes that have happened on the various sites there. So, fingers crossed, we've got... I always put this one up because one or two of the clubs I talk to, not you of course, in Shropshire, don't really know where Shropshire is. So I always actually say, with the green bit there, you see, that's us, that's Shropshire. Getting closer to the study area today, Telford of course, and that is Telford there, of course. Started off life, in fact they're celebrating 50 years as a new town this year, you probably know, because Dahle New Town, which was designated in 1963, was renamed Telford in 1968, so 2018 they're celebrating 50 years. It's important because of course the designated area of Telford was deliberately chosen, the boundary was deliberately chosen to include Ironbridge Gorge for a very good reason, because it needed such a lot of money spent on it in the early days that they needed to actually have access to major government funds, which only came for it being within the boundary of Telford Development Corporation. This is the area we're looking at, of course. The blue, of course, is the River Severn, which you know very well. And we've got the bridge itself there, just there. The Museum of the Gorge is actually the only museum right on the riverside there. Coalbrookdale, where, of course, it all started, the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, 1709. We'll come to that in a minute. And we've got down here, we've got the Jackfield Tile Museum, we've got Coalport, and we've got, of course, the most popular site of the 10, the Bliss Hill Victorian town there, the Open Air Museum. So we'll start here, and you might look at that and think, well, I don't think that can be there anymore, but that whole range of buildings does still exist. I think the photographer to take this picture must have been standing on Birthplace Bridge, not the Birthplace Bridge that you see today, but the Birthplace Bridge that was built by Thomas Telford in 1796. But that came down in 1906, so I think this particular picture dates from pre-1906. And if you try to work it out, I'm standing now on the current Birthplace Bridge, and that range is still there, with the addition of a few electric pylons, which go to the power station, and the addition of a bit of ivy as well. But you know, if you go back there, that is still essentially the same range that you can see today. Moving a little bit there. What we're looking at here is the medieval Birthplace Bridge, built in the 15th century, being repaired under Thomas Telford's direction. He was county surveyor at the time. We're looking at 1792, a major flood. We're used to floods on the River Severn, you certainly are here in Shropshire, and it damaged that particular part, that particular arch of the medieval Birthplace Bridge. Now Thomas Telford was responsible for actually repairing that bridge in 1792. 3 years later, February 1795, the biggest flood ever to hit the River Severn, before or since, damaged or badly destroyed every bridge on the River Severn from Welshpool down to the Bristol Channel. Only one bridge survived completely intact, and that was the Iron Bridge itself of 1779. So when Thomas Telford was actually commissioned to rebuild the bridge that 3 years previously he'd repaired, he built his first bridge in iron. Following on from Derby's bridge of 1779, he decided he would actually use, for the first time in his career, iron. And that was what Thomas Telford's Builder's Bridge looked like when it was built in 1796, and it stayed there until 1906. Why can't we see it today? Well, you know how geologically unstable the gorge is. The two sides are generally trying to meet each other. Major landslips still happen to this very day in the gorge. And there was one, let me have another picture there. On just this side here, there was a major landslip in 1906, which necessitated taking down the whole of this bridge, replacing it eventually with what we drive over today. It's a shame because it was a very nice bridge. Interesting enough, that was built in 1796, 17 years after the bridge down at Ironbridge itself, the world's first iron bridge. 16 years had elapsed. It was still only the third iron bridge in the world at the time, Builder's Bridge of 1796. So these new materials, these new techniques don't get taken up as quickly as we sometimes expect they would. And just a few mementos there put up by Shropshire County Council of the various history of the bridges along the side. And that's the current bridge there, not quite as nice looking, aesthetically looking as the Telford Bridge. Interestingly, if you do walk down there, you can actually see these studs here, which were left there deliberately as a memento of Thomas Telford's bridge. These are the sort of points where his arches sprang from there, so they're left there as a memento of Thomas Telford's bridge of 1796. There's a building called the Meadow Inn. This is what it originally looked like in about 1900, and it's changed quite dramatically there. That's what it looks like now, but it's still essentially the same building, the Meadow Inn. I should have taken a picture at Christmas time because this was dressed up amazingly with lights on, Santa Claus and sleighs and everything. It was an incredible sight. Some of you may have actually been in this building. It was built for one of the Moore family, the famous tile family of Moores. And it was known as Seven House, private house. Some of you will perhaps know it today as the Valley Hotel. This is now the Valley Hotel at Coalbrookdale. You can see it's a private house, you know, nice tennis match going on and children playing there and having tea here. And I'm just wondering, this is a fellow that lived there for many years, a man by the name of Thomas Parker. Now I'm going to ask you, does the name Thomas Parker ring any bells with anybody in the audience? And I don't expect anybody... Oh, there's somebody there. Say? Let me tell you, yes, I can't quite hear that because my hearing is not so good, but let me see if it's still talking about Thomas Parker. You obviously clearly know who this is. Why do I mention him? Because I reckon this chap should actually be mentioned in the same breath as Abraham Darby and William Reynolds and people like that. He's not involved in iron, he's involved in the electrical engineering industry. He lived at Seven House, he was Coalbrookdale born, and he's buried in Coalbrookdale as well. In Coalbrookdale Church, that's it there, which was built, interesting enough, by Abraham Darby IV, who actually gave up the Quaker religion to come back to the Church of England. But in this church is something I've never seen anywhere else. It's a sort of CV of this chap. You know, you often see memorials, but you don't actually see the sort of CV of this particular chap, Thomas Parker. You probably won't be able to read that, but it starts at the top. Let me just see if I can. No, I'll go back. It starts at the top that he was responsible for the first electric tramway in the world. A whole series of inventions in the electrical trade there. Right down the bottom, you see what at the end. He's responsible for electrifying the London Underground system. I'd never heard of him. Lady here clearly has. But he's an unknown name. Another one of those famous Victorian, late Victorian engineers we should know a lot more about. Thomas Parker, great man. And that, of course, is the Valley Hotel now. And what was originally mostly private land belonging to the Seven House is now a public park, the Dahle End Park. And of course, you have the railway there. Of course, they took the trains across the river to Buildwas and then carried on down. Obviously, there was a junction at Buildwas for the Severn Valley Line, where it carried on down to Much Wenlock and joined the main line at Craven Arms. And of course, until very recently, it carried mineral trains down to the power station, but of course the power station is closed and no trains there run now. But the lines are still there. Interestingly enough, the the line, this preserved line at Dahle, just up the line there, wants very much to actually run trains down here. Would love to be able to do that, and obviously we're talking about a lot of money needed to actually restore the line back as a leisure line. And of course, just to show you how in many cases in the gorge nature has taken over, you can actually see the tower of Coalbrookdale Church there, but of course and now is completely covered by vegetation. Now, just to give you an idea as to how the use of some of the buildings in Coalbrookdale have changed, this particular picture dates back to about 1910 as the engineering works at the Coalbrookdale Company in Coalbrookdale, heavy engineering men working there. That building still exists, but today all the machinery is gone, and what that building is used for, what that room is used for now, is events, conferences, black ties dinner, completely changed, but you know that's often the case around the Telford area. You can tell it's the same building because of the shape of the windows either side. That was the Quaker Meeting House at Coalbrookdale. That's gone and was replaced by that building there, which was a pottery at the time. That's now, I think, a private house. But behind it, we will see that in a minute, is the Quaker burial ground. I don't know if anybody's actually walked around the back of that particular building, which is called the Chestnuts, and you'll see the Quaker burial ground at the back. We'll come back to that later on in the show. Down by the wharfage here, we're getting very close to the river. You probably won't recognise that because all this has gone. This building still exists, and all this range has gone, because what you're looking at now, or will be when I show you the next slide, is a car park to the Museum of the Gorge, right on the riverside. This is still here. We'll have a look at it in a minute. There we are. That's the building which is still here on the left, but the whole of that row has gone, revealing a view of the Museum of the Gorge there. And that is now the museum's car park. A view from the other side, this is what that range looked like. The road is behind. That building there, I'm indicating with the red dot, still exists, but all this has gone for that car park. And from the other side of the river, this shot was taken. There it is there. It's often called the Gothic Warehouse because the style of architecture. That's the Museum of the Gorge now. This is all gone, that still remains, and that's the car park that was that row of cottages. It's called Naylor's Row. So many rows of cottages have actually disappeared over the last 50, 100 years. Aerial view here, Ordnance Survey of course. There's the museum, there it is now, and that Naylor's Row has disappeared there. This of course, this building here, is the Merrythorpe's building. The Merrythorpe's Rolls-Royce of soft toys and teddy bears, still making, on a reduced scale, still making teddy bears there on the side, have been doing so ever since 1930. Some of you might recognise this. I mean, it's a nice shot here of a fishing party here. In those days it was called the Talbot Inn. We're right on the wharfage here. It's now the Malt House, which is one of the rather pleasant hostelries along the riverside there. So it was the Talbot, now the Malt House. Some things have gone and you think, thank heavens they did. So this is a bit of a nasty excrescence here in front of this building here. Luckily that's gone now. I still haven't made my mind up about the colour though, I must admit, the purple, I'm not quite sure about that. The fact that that building has gone, I think, is very much an improvement to that part of the wharfage. And another hostelry here, the White Hart, still called the White Hart. The tree has gone, which is a bit of a shame I suppose, but it's still doing very good business. That's the White Hart. We're getting closer each time to the Ironbridge itself, moving east along the river. And there's another view of the courtyard. And this is a building, you might think, well, that hasn't changed very much, but of course a lot of work has happened on this row here. And look at this group of buildings here. There's the bridge, of course, as you can see. That has now gone completely. That went in the late 40s, early 1950s. And I'll show you, because it's still quite surprising, the narrowness of the land that that block actually stood on. I'll show you a close-up picture in a moment. And I was also quite interested in this one here. There's that block I was telling you about. This is the wharfage here, and you go up Taunton Hill there, gets you into the square there, and this block has completely gone there. But I was quite intrigued to see this smokestack here, very close to the Ironbridge itself. And it wasn't until I looked at an Ordnance Survey map that I realised what I was looking at there. Because in fact there was a big brick and tile works there, and that was the site of that particular smokestack there, the bridge being here. And that block of buildings that's gone stood on that site there. And it's probably difficult to actually, when you're there, to actually realise such a big block stood on such a narrow bit of land. And there it is gone. That building is the other side of the bridge. The buildings that have gone were just about there. And this is them coming down. This particular photographer was standing on the Ironbridge himself, looking over here, and you can see these buildings coming down. And they are gone because you're looking at the other side here of Taunton Hill, and the church is just off picture here. And this is a side-on view. If you can imagine, the bridge is on this side here. This is Taunton Hill here. You can just see a car there, and you think, well, crikey, I can't envisage that block when you see what you see now. That stood on that land there. You wouldn't think that that's quite a narrow strip of land, but it housed that huge block of buildings. And of course the railway came through. We're looking at a mini here, so we're talking about late 50s, early 1960s. And of course the railway finished, this is the Severn Valley Line, of course, finished in the early 1960s, one of Dr. Beeching's cuts. This is the footbridge over the railway. There's the start of the Ironbridge itself there, and we're in the market here, and the church is just off picture here. Looking down, aerial view shows you just how much land was taken up by the railway. There's the bridge, and all this now is Carpark, of course. That's the road that takes you up to Benthall and Broseley, up that way. And that's that block of buildings that's disappeared. And of course, just to tell you that there used to be a railway here, they've left the lines along the roadway there, leading to the bridge itself. Standing on the apex of the bridge, looking down towards the Thompson Hotel, which thankfully is still there, and of course that's the side view of that block which disappeared, church behind. And there we are, it's gone. You can see the back of Taunton Hill shops there. Another view there, that's gone, this has gone as well. The War Memorial used to stand in the square, is now on this side of the road. We'll see that in a minute. And the fountain, which was there, that was a fountain, is now at the back of the Waterloo Street car park, a little bit further east. So you see the War Memorial's moved on to the other side of the road there. It used to be about there. And of course that block of buildings there is gone, revealing a view of Benthall Edge there. Moving east, further east, up High Street, looking up towards the church here, you can just see the tower of the church. It's a rather nice building, turned the corner nicely, municipal buildings, obviously belonging to the Wenlock Borough. Unfortunately that's all disappeared. I think, again, subsidence led to its disappearance. And that's a view, giving you a slightly longer view of it. Nice corner here. Unfortunately, it looks like that now. That's gone and replaced by all the paraphernalia that comes with the roads and the traffic. And of course, new feature on the horizon, the power station towers. I'd love to think that they would still stay there, but it's certain that they will actually be demolished in the next year, 18 months, something like that. It's my favourite power station, but I would say that, wouldn't I, obviously. I used to be the tourism manager, by the way, of Telford and Wrekin Council, so I used to sell this area to visitors. I like that power station, but that will come down because of course the maintenance of those cooling towers would be extraordinarily expensive. Looking up the other way, looking east, looking up towards Madeley, a number of these buildings thankfully are still here. That one is, and that one on the corner, but a number as you go up the hill towards Madeley, they've disappeared as well. And that's the view you get now. Building on the corner here gone, and the ones here have gone as well. But the important corner building there is still there, and that is still there too. That was Beddoes, a nice old-fashioned ironmonger's there. Building is still there, is now, as in so many cases, an estate agent. looking down from the bottom of Churchill, there's only one building that you can see in this view, which you can still see today, and it's that building there, which is the old police station. All of this has gone, as you can see, late 50s, early 60s. It's about to be demolished, as you can see, as the photographer is taking a shot. As one of the very earliest police stations built in Shropshire, in fact, it now houses a very good Indian restaurant. They don't pay me for saying that, but they really should. I keep saying it. It's called the Pondicherry. If you like Indian food, it's a very nice Indian restaurant there. But to give you an idea of the changes, that's all gone for the mini roundabout here at the bottom of Madeley Hill and at the start of Waterloo Street here. So that's what it looked like. That's what it looks like now. Back in the centre of Ironbridge, a shop which still exists. You can still see the same windows above on each of the slides I'm going to show you. Was Elcock's originally. When I used to work for the local authority, Telford and Rick, and I used to show this to my friends in environmental health, and they gave them the heebie-jeebies. They didn't like this at all. They said, oh, we couldn't allow that today. It then moved to the Central Cafe. Again, you can still see it's the same building because of these windows here, and it's now a fish and chip shop, quite a good fish and chip shop, in fact. Yeah, the same buildings there. So these buildings go through several changes in the course of their lifetime. And that happened in the last 10, 15 years, those three changes. Further east on Waterloo Street, Ironbridge had two cinemas. This was one of them, the Central Cinema. That went to replace, not a very good picture I'm afraid, but replaced by this group of flats here, called Valentino Row, because the first picture ever to be shown in that picture house was a Rudolph Valentino picture. I guessed that and it turned out to be true. And again, something that's gone, not a very pretty sight, this industrial building here, as we're moving down towards Coalport, replaced by, I think, which is something much better, some flats and houses there. This is the road that takes you down to Coalport. And on the road to Coalport, of course, you've got what used to be the Free Bridge. This is the Free Bridge in construction. We're talking 1908. It became a listed building because it was listed not for its aesthetic appearance, because it was never the most beautiful bridge in the world, but it was one of the very earliest bridges built in this country, made of reinforced concrete, so it was listed for its technological innovation. And of course that was taken down about in the early 1990s because it got dangerous, to be replaced by the new Free Bridge. Free, of course, because there was no toll on it, unlike the Ironbridge itself. And that's it there. And this is it coming down in the early 1990s, replaced by a temporary Bailey Bridge affair there. And that's the bridge. I used to be the only person in the room that actually said, I like that bridge. Hopefully more people are getting used to that. Because, matter of opinion, I'm sure, but the last thing I would have wanted on that site for a new bridge would be to have some sort of facsimile, a copy of the Ironbridge. I think that would have been the wrong view. But that's just a personal view. I think bridges should be of their time, and it certainly was of its time in the early 1990s. And this picture was taken from the old Free Bridge, showing you a group of cottages, most of which, as you can imagine, are no longer there. That is still there. That's the pub, the Robin Hood pub. But that's it there. But this whole row here, I've taken this from the new bridge, has gone. So what it was like, and that's what it was now. That building there is that building there. On this side, the Jackfield side, the Black Swan still exists, but these cottages here have gone, because that's the view you see now, and some local authority housing further down the road there. This is on the Jackfield side of the river. Another terrace which has gone, we're on the north side of the river, moving all the way down to Coalport as we go. This building here is still in, the Shakespeare Inn. This used to be called Jug Row, because the pub in the middle was called the Jug, and again, that's gone, and you can imagine what that went for. What's there now, of course, is the car park to the pub. We're very close to the tar tunnel here. I don't know if you know the tar tunnel at all at Coalport, leading up to the inclined plane which takes you up to the top of Bliss Hill. That's just the other side of the Shakespeare Inn there. Further back you can see it's quite a, this is where Jug Row used to be, it's now the car park to the pub. We're in Coalport, and we're looking down, or at least the photographer here was looking down on the end of the Coalport Dodger line. This was a sort of cul-de-sac railway which went from Wellington, looped round through Ketley, down through Oakengates, Madeley, and ended up here at Coalport. Coalport had two railway stations. This was one on the north side of the river, and of course the railway station on the other side on the Severn Valley line, which you can still see the remains of. But of course the railway line has gone, and what you see now, because of course the bridge that this photographer was standing on still exists over the gap, I stood where I thought he was standing, and what you see now, all gone. And all you see is the track, which is now part of Silken Way, which is the major footpath right through the town from northwest down to southeast. And of course there's no sign that there used to be, I'm not saying it was a thriving railway station, but there was a bit of activity there. But you wouldn't know at all if you were looking down today what used to be there. That's what it was, and that's what you see now. In many cases, especially at the east end of the gorge, nature has taken over. This is the view from the pub gardens, the Woodbridge Inn, which is where the photographer is standing on this side, the south side of the river, looking at the bridge there. That's Coalport Bridge, dated 1818. Started off life as a wooden bridge, by the way, in the late 18th century, and changed in about 1818. And again, you can just see a railway carriage there. We're looking at the railway line, and that's the end of the railway line there. And okay, what can you see now? So I'm standing in the pub garden, and again, the forest has taken over. You can barely see the bridge itself. And that's the end of our then and now. I thought what I do now is just bring you up to date on what the museums look like now. I don't know if, hopefully some of you are actually maybe friends of Ironbridge Gorge Museum. We do have a friends organisation which helps support the museum. It's 50 years old this year, by the way, is Ironbridge Gorge. This isn't one of my shots. I borrowed this from the museum. They call this their Tuscany shot. They said it makes the gorge look a bit like Tuscany, which, taken in the autumn, it probably does. It's a rather nice shot, looking down on the world's first iron bridge, of course. And this shot, when it was taken, about 20 years ago, was taken by a specialist firm called Skyscan, who have a balloon which they hoist up to about 100 feet above the ground, and they have their camera attached to it, or they had their camera attached to it, and to take this particular picture. Today, of course, this sort of shot would be taken by a drone, as you can imagine, and we see them all the time. But this was quite special when it was originally taken, because it gives you it gives you quite an interesting image, because it's the only way you would actually see the bridge itself, and sorry, come back a bit. There we are. The bridge itself and the summit of the Wrekin Hill in the same image. You wouldn't normally do that. So it's quite an interesting shot. It also gives you an idea how the town grew up after that bridge was constructed. There was no medieval bridge there. This wasn't a successor to an older bridge. It was just a ferry crossing point at this stage. And it was built in 1779. You know the date's written on the side of the bridge itself. Opened to traffic on the 1st of January 1781. And there was really nothing there, apart from maybe one or two fishermen's huts. There was no town, of course, called Ironbridge. The whole of this area was called Coalbrookdale, or in fact Madeley as you get further up. And of course we see the town growing after this bridge was opened. The first major building to be opened after the bridge was, of course, the Taunton Hotel, which thankfully still exists there, built in 1784. And in 1800, the square itself, the market square, was built. The church didn't come much later, in fact, mid-1830s, the church was built there, and then the town grew up around it. And that gives you an idea of the location again. Coalbrookdale, at the northwest end of the gorge, of course, is where it all started. And we sometimes forget what an important role Coalbrookdale played, not just in our history, but in the world's history, because it is genuinely, all experts now reckon, to be the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The date is 1709. The man is Abraham Darby the First. whose grandson, the third, built the Iron Bridge. We'll come to that later on. And what he did in 1709 doesn't, to us, sound very groundbreaking. He was the first iron master in the world to perfect the technique of making iron, smelting iron, using a new fuel. Previously, the fuel had been charcoal from wood. That had been leading to the destruction of all our woods and forests. Wood was getting in very short supply. He actually managed to perfect the technique of using coke from coal. As I say, it doesn't sound very groundbreaking, but it really was, because that led to a whole series of innovations, new techniques that happened in Coalbrookdale. After 1709, a few years after that, the world's first iron rails were made in Coalbrookdale. A few years after that, the world's first iron wheel was made in Coalbrookdale. 1787, the world's first iron boat, believe it or not, the world's first iron boat was made very close to Coalbrookdale, floated on the River Severn near Willie. And of course 1779 itself, the world's first iron bridge. We go into 1801, 1802, we see the world's first steam locomotive being made in Coalbrookdale and also at the same time in Bridgnorth. Not by a local saloon, but by a Cornishman, a man by the name of Richard Trevithick. He had to come up to Shropshire where the skills and the expertise were. So we're at the start of that form of industry as well, the first steam locomotive, 1802, Coalbrookdale. And of course, where that smelting took place is now covered by that cover building there at Coalbrookdale. And that's going to have a new building very close to it shortly to give visitors a much better idea of the whole history of ironmaking on the site. And of course, in the early days, the Coalbrookdale Company, the company owned by Abraham Darby, was famous for, world famous in fact, for its pots and pans, big ones, little ones, ones like that one. And in the 18th century, that was their stock in trade. In the 19th century, when in fact Coalbrookdale lost the lead of ironmaking to other places like the Black Country, Sheffield and South Wales, they moved into art castings like this, and this is something you can see at the Museum of Iron at Coalbrookdale. And very recently, over the last couple of years, they've actually, I think in fact only last year, they've reordered the whole of the Coalbrookdale Museum of Iron. It's a much better visitor experience there now. If you haven't been to Coalbrookdale for a few years, do go back again and see what they've done there. That's the amazing deerhound table. Not the prettiest table in the world, but really quite extraordinary. I don't know if anybody remembers seeing it. It weighs 2 tons. Now, I always had this idea that, you know, it was privately owned, it was in somebody's house. I can imagine, you know, Pickford's being directed by the lady of the house saying, no, I don't think I'll have it there, I think I'll have it there. 2 tons of waste. And of course a view of the Great Exhibition. Of course the Coalbrookdale Company did very well at the Great Exhibition of 1851. And something that you can still see on the site of the Great Exhibition, I'm standing in Hyde Park looking across these gates to Kensington Gardens. Just on my left out of the picture is the Albert Hall. You probably can figure out where we are. And these gates, which are called the Coalbrookdale Gates, of course were made in Coalbrookdale, formed an integral part of the Crystal Palace. In fact, you can see old pictures of the interior of the Crystal Palace showing the Coalbrookdale Gates there. And if you look very closely, you can see the badge underneath there, Coalbrookdale Company, Shropshire, still forming part of the division between Hyde Park and Kensington Gardens. Famous picture, Philip de Lutherberg, 1800, 1801, something like that. Coalbrookdale by night is called. The original is in the Science Museum in London, but there are copies elsewhere. Allowing for a bit of artistic license, this is what life looked like in the gorge in the latter part of the 18th century. They reckon the site is in fact now the site that we now know as Bednam Furnaces, right down by the river. And it was full of smoke and steam and noise, because again we tend to forget that in the latter part of the 18th century, Coalbrookdale and the whole of the gorge was the most important iron-making area in the world. 1 out of every 4 tons of iron made in the UK were made in this particular part of this very remote county, Coalbrookdale. As I say, after the 1800s, when we get past the Napoleonic Wars, then it loses its lead. It's no longer in the lead in terms of iron making. new techniques happen in other parts of the country, in the Black Country, South Wales, Sheffield, places like that. This is, now I'm going to have to go there and take another picture because there's a new cover building very recently been erected over to protect the Bedlam furnaces. We're right at I've got the river behind me, and this is the site of the Bedlam furnaces where they reckon, very close to the site of the Ironbridge itself, this is where they reckon the Ironbridge ribs were actually cast. Not in Coalbrookdale as we know it, but here on the riverside. And there's a new cover building to protect the site, which has only recently been erected. I must go back and take a picture of that. Ingenuity, back in Coalbrookdale, the most recently opened of the 10 museum sites at Coalbrookdale and throughout the gorge. One of these hands-on interactive museums, great for grandparents and grandchildren. If you've got any grandchildren, take them there, they'd love it, you'd love it too. That tells you how the world works, energy, power, that sort of thing. And that's a typical picture you'll see there. Ingenuity, just around the back of the Museum of Iron at Coalbrookdale. Just up the hill from there you've got two major houses, Derby houses, Rose Hill and Dahle House, both dating back to the early years of the 18th century, well laid out and well worth a visit. Developed to National Trust standards there, Rose Hill House and Dahle House. And behind, as I mentioned earlier on, behind Chestnut House, you've got the Quaker burial ground with the remains of the Quaker families. Most of the iron-making families and their relatives were in fact of the Quaker religion. And of course all a Quaker was having on the gravestone was just the name, the date of death and the age of death. No other memorial was allowed. And of course we've got Abraham Darby I, we've Abraham Darby II, Abraham Darby III. I can't show you any pictures of them. They didn't, obviously we're pre-photography here in the 18th century, but none of them had any portraits painted of them. And it's only when we get to Abraham Darby IV, who I said converted back to the Church of England, that we actually know what an Abraham Darby looked like. I don't think I've got his picture here, but there is a picture, a photograph of Abraham Darby IV, but nobody can show you what the Abraham Darbys 1, 2 and 3 look like. That's one of the Darbys there, aged 52 years. They didn't live long, I'm afraid, but they did an awful lot while they were alive. William Reynolds was connected by marriage to the Darby family, great engineer and entrepreneur. And he was the one that actually laid out the canal system on the coalfield and was responsible with Thomas Telford for creating the world's first, another Shropshire world's first, the world's first cast iron aqueduct, which is a place called Longden-on-Tern. I don't know if you know Longden-on-Tern, just to the northwest of Wellington. 1796, the world's first cast iron aqueduct, another Shropshire world's first. Museum of the Gorge, the one right down by the riverside, Gothic warehouse it's sometimes called, gone through a number of different uses, built originally as a warehouse of the Coalbrookdale Company. The goods made in Coalbrookdale up the valley were brought down here to the riverside, and if the river was in spate or too low to be navigated, then the goods were stored in that warehouse until the river was at the right level again, and then taken out and then downstream on Severn Trowers down to Gloucester or Bristol. Inside, what that chap's looking at is in fact a series of height marks telling you how far the floods reached in past years, and that one there telling you that that was the height the flood reached in 1795, the date when the worst flood of all happened. Inside there you've got this 40-foot model of what the gorge looked like in the late 18th century. And of course the centrepiece of the whole gorge is of course the Ironbridge itself. Now when I used to show this picture, I'm just going to take a bit of water if I may. When I used to show this to school children, I used to confuse them. I was deliberately trying to confuse them. I was saying, you're not looking at an iron bridge at all. You're looking at a wooden bridge, just happens to be made out of iron. What I was trying to, you can imagine what I was trying to get over, because if you look at, this is the world's first iron bridge. People didn't know, in those days, ironmasters didn't know about the jointing techniques that became fashionable later on and popular later on, the riveting and such like. So when you look at joints here in this new material, cast iron, you're seeing the same sort of joints that a carpenter would have used in putting together a timber bridge. You're seeing doweling, you're seeing mortise and tenon joints, you're seeing dovetail joints in this new material, just like a carpenter would have used in putting together a timber bridge. So that was what I was trying to say. It was a timber bridge, just happened to be made out of this new material. And 1779 is the date when it was open to traffic on the 1st of January 1781, and of course was continued to be open to traffic until the middle of the 20th century, and of course it's still a walkover. I have to say, I don't know if anybody's been there recently, it's all scaffolding. They're doing a major repair job. So I'm sorry, I feel sorry for visitors that are coming this year. They're thinking, oh, we're going to take a nice picture of this lovely bridge. And they're not, because it's covered up. But much needed repair work is going to be done. So hopefully the thing will be out for another 200 years when they're finished the work. And at night time you get that nice, when the river is really still, you get that nice circular effect there. This isn't Abraham Darby III, the man that created the bridge. This is the man that actually designed the world's first iron bridge. The name, I don't know if it means anything to anybody, Thomas Farnells Pritchard. Thomas Farnells Pritchard, I hear a number of people saying yes. But most people wouldn't know who he was, wouldn't know what he was responsible for. He was a very well-known Shrewsbury architect in his day, in the middle years of the 18th century. And he did a lot of work in major houses around the county, a lot of work right in the centre of Shrewsbury. And he was the chap who designed the world's first iron bridge. He didn't live to see it even started, so that's perhaps one of the reasons why we've forgotten this chap. We do know about Abraham Darby III, we tend to forget about the man that actually designed it. That's what he looked like, Thomas Farnells Pritchard. Back to the east of the gorge, Jackfield Tile Museum. Now, when I first came to the gorge, because I'm not local, I'm not a local Salopian, when I came to Shropshire in the late 70s, I wasn't particularly interested in tiles as such until I went to Jackfield. And when you see the range and the colour and the designs there, especially the new gallery that's been created over the last 3 or 4 years, which, and I'm sure they're right, the museum tells me, Jackfield is now the best tile gallery in the world, not just the UK, not just Europe. The outside doesn't look very prepossessing. Of course, we're looking at one of the... Jackfield, of course, in the late 19th century, 1870, 1880, was the world centre of the encaustic tile industry. Moores, Craven Dunhill, 2 major firms, and their products were exported all over the world. You can go to New Zealand, you can go to government buildings in New Zealand, you can go to Maharaja's palaces in India and see Jackfield tiles. And they've got a nice little cafe there as well. I'm very keen to actually have cafes wherever I go. Especially tea. I'm sure you are too. That sort of thing. There was an eminent collector, probably the best collector of porcelain, pottery and tiles in the country, a man by the name of John Scott, who has donated virtually his entire collection to Jackfield, and they created a new gallery, and you ought to go and see it. You really ought to. It has the most marvellous things in it. These are just some examples of the Jackfield Tile Museum. Across the river, of course, Coalport itself. 1796 it started, and worked right through to 1926, producing in that time some of the finest porcelain made in Europe. Works finished in 1926, almost overnight, and moved up to the potteries, Stoke-on-Trent, where of course Coalport has been connected ever since. And of course a number of you perhaps might have a little bit of Coalport hidden away at home. It often turns up at Antiques Roadshow and shops, shows like that. And it's got a very good social history museum as well, not just telling you about the product, but telling you about the life of the people that made the products. Really interesting place at Coalport. And of course, finishing off, and this is where we nearly come to the end here, the most popular site, I suppose, biggest, and certainly it appeals to everybody in the family, the Blissfield Victorian town. This is the relatively new visitor centre as you enter the site. They've had 2 or 3 different visitor centres. This is what you go through now. And it's got I don't know if anybody's been there, but it's got the best audio-visual show I've seen at the start of any museum, and it's certainly the loudest. Certainly go there. It gives you an idea as to what happened on the site. There was no community there. There was no village of Bliss Hill. There was a tileworks, the canal ran through it. There was a brickworks there, ironworks, of course. But it wasn't a settlement where people lived. What the museum have done since they started it in 1973, this first opened to the public in 1973, they've actually saved buildings, in many cases, from demolition on their original sites in the locality, moved the materials, brick by brick, tile by tile, to this new site and built that building up again. And in doing so, created a new settlement, as it were. A sort of typical settlement that you might have seen on the coalfield at the back end of the 19th century, 1895, 1900. The building there, the pub came from Walsall, for example, a bit further afield than most of the other buildings on the site. The candle factory came from Madeley. Excuse me for showing this, but in the summertime, nice summer Sunday afternoon perhaps, you'll see Boer War Reenactments, you'll see Victorian weddings. I'm showing you this because that's one of my daughters there. She got married at Bliss Hill on the Saturday and got married again on the Sunday, and it didn't cost me a penny. When she does get married, it'll be a bit different. So that's the sort of thing you can see on Bliss Hill on a nice summer afternoon. And of course, lots of animals on the site as well, pigs, that sort of thing. And of course, everybody's in costume. And of course, I don't know if anybody remembers the Tea Pavilion, Forest Glen, used to be on the side of the Wrekin Hill, of course, perhaps some of you, I can remember going there to dinner dances in the late 70s, before it got into disrepair, and what remained of Forest Glen was moved onto the site, and that is still performing the original function that it had on the Wrekin Hill itself. I used to live not far from Oaken Gates, and I can remember when I used to live in Oaken Gates, I walked down to the bridge, the railway bridge right in the centre of town. Right next to the railway bridge, there was this little cobbler shop there. It's no longer in Oaken Gates, it's been moved to Bliss Hill, as are so many other of the buildings there. And these buildings here have been designed, these are facsimile buildings in these particular cases, designed to the designs of buildings you can still see in Wellington Town Centre. And right at the end here, if you're lucky enough, because it only happens on 2 or 3 weekends a year in Bliss Hill, you can actually see genuine wrought iron being made. It only happens on a few occasions because it's a very expensive operation to fund. And the last machinery that actually used to make wrought iron came from Bolton. The Atlas works at Bolton were bought or taken over by the museum. They transported them down to Bliss Hill, rebuilt the museum, rebuilt the works here, put a new cover building on which came from Woolwich Arsenal, and as I say, 2 or 3 weekends a year you can actually see. It's the only genuine wrought iron being made in the Western world. What we often see as wrought iron, or being publicised as wrought iron, is really just mild steel. It's not the genuine article. In Bliss Hill, they're still occasionally making the genuine article. That is my last slide, ladies and gentlemen, and it just hopefully gives you an idea as to how the gorge has changed, or in some cases hasn't changed. We still can see an awful lot that has always been there. I must encourage you, if you haven't been there for some time, come and have a nice walk along the riverside, go inside some of the museums, because they're always changing, they're always improving the museums. Have a great day, it's just down the road from here. Thank you very much indeed.